Story 1. The fluorescent lights buzzed, a dull counterpoint to Mrs. Davison droning on about Shakespearean sonnets. Outside, the late October sky was bruised purple, threatening rain. I doodled in my notebook, a grotesque parody of Romeo and Juliet as zombies, when the first announcement crackled over the intercom. Code red. Lockdown procedures initiated. This is not a drill. My stomach lurched. Not a drill. The words echoed in the sudden, shocked silence. Mrs. Davison's face, usually placid, went white. Everyone, under your desks. Now! We scrambled, the scraping of desks a frantic symphony. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here, in our sleepy little town, in our ordinary high school. Minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. The silence was punctuated by muffled sobs and whispered prayers. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from my best friend, Sarah, in the classroom next door. What's happening? I'm scared. I typed back, me too. Stay hidden. Then, we heard it. A low, guttural moan echoing from the hallway. It wasn't human. It was something else. The sound sent a shiver crawling down my spine. More moans followed, closer this time, accompanied by a sickening, wet thudding sound. Like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Someone whimpered. Mrs. Davison put a finger to her lips, her eyes wide with terror. The doorknob rattled. We held our breath. The rattling stopped. Then, a slow, deliberate scratching began, like fingernails on wood. The sound grew louder, more insistent. The wood splintered. A single, bloodshot eye peered through the widening crack. It wasn't an eye I recognized. It was too large, too inhuman. The iris was a swirling vortex of crimson and black. The scratching stopped. The eye disappeared. We waited, suspended in an agonizing limbo. Then, the moaning returned, further away this time, fading down the hall. Minutes stretched into an hour. The silence was heavy, oppressive. We stayed huddled under our desks, too terrified to move. My phone buzzed again. Sarah. Something's wrong. People are changing. Changing? What did she mean? I typed back, what do you mean, changing? But there was no reply. The intercom crackled to life. The lockdown is over. Please proceed to the gymnasium for further instructions. The voice was calm, official, but something about it felt off. Mrs. Davison cautiously rose, her face pale and drawn. Everyone, stay together, she whispered, her voice trembling. We filed out of the classroom, a silent, terrified procession. The hallway was eerily quiet, the air thick with a coppery tang. As we rounded the corner, we saw it. A body lay sprawled on the floor. It was Mr. Henderson, the history teacher. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. But it wasn't his lifeless gaze that horrified us. It was his form. His skin was stretched taut, almost translucent, revealing pulsating veins and twitching muscles beneath. His fingers were elongated, tipped with wickedly sharp claws. And from his back, protruding through his torn shirt, were two extra limbs. Thin, skeletal arms, ending in grotesque, fleshy tendrils. We recoiled in horror. Mrs. Davison screamed. Then, we heard the moaning again, closer this time, coming from the gymnasium. The same guttural, inhuman sound, but now it was interspersed with something else, a chorus of high-pitched, chittering whispers. We backed away, our eyes fixed on the gymnasium doors. They swung open slowly, revealing a scene of unimaginable horror. Students and teachers milled about, their bodies contorted into grotesque shapes. Some had extra limbs, like Mr. Henderson. Others had skin that shimmered and pulsed with an unnatural light. Their eyes glowed with the same crimson and black swirl we had seen through the crack in the classroom door. They turned towards us, their faces twisted into horrifying smiles. The chittering grew louder, more insistent. And then they began to move towards us, their limbs twitching, their eyes burning. I grabbed Sarah's phone from my pocket. Her last message was still displayed on the screen. Below my unanswered question, "What do you mean, changing?" was a single, chilling line, "We are becoming them." We turned and ran, our screams echoing in the empty hallway. The chittering whispers pursued us, growing louder, closer. We ran blindly, desperately searching for an escape. But the school felt different now, alien, hostile. The walls seemed to pulsate, the air thick with the stench of decay. We were trapped, hunted. The last thing I remember is the feeling of cold, clammy hands grabbing my ankles, dragging me down. And the chittering whispers, right in my ear, whispering secrets I never wanted to hear. I don't know what happened next. I don't know if anyone escaped. I only know the darkness, and the whispers, and the horrifying realization that we are all changing. We are all becoming them. Story 2. Story 2, The Whispering Walls. The fluorescent lights buzzed, casting a sickly yellow glow over Mrs. Henderson's pre-calculus lecture. Rain lashed against the windows, a monotonous drumming that lulled me into a near-sleep state. Jenna, beside me, nudged my elbow. "You gonna drool on your textbook, Sarah?" she whispered, a smirk playing on her lips. I blinked, a thin line of drool dangling precariously from my chin. Embarrassed, I wiped it away and forced myself to focus on the quadratic equation scrawled across the board. Then the intercom crackled. Principal Thompson's voice, usually booming and authoritative, wavered slightly. Code red. Lockdown initiated. All students and faculty, please follow lockdown protocol. My heart hammered against my ribs. Code red. We'd practiced them countless times, but this felt different. A palpable tension rippled through the classroom. Mrs. Henderson, her face drained of color, fumbled with the lock on the door, her hands shaking. We huddled in the corner, lights extinguished, curtains drawn. The rain continued its incessant drumming, each drop a tiny hammer blow against the glass. The initial flurry of whispers and panicked texts died down, replaced by a suffocating silence. Time stretched, distorted. It felt like hours, maybe days, that we sat there, crammed together in the suffocating darkness. Then, I heard it. A faint whisper, like dry leaves rustling in a windless autumn. I thought it was my imagination, the product of fear and confinement. But it came again, closer this time, a sibilant murmur that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Jenna, my voice trembling. She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "Hear what, Sarah?" The whispering intensified. It was no longer a murmur, but a chorus of voices, overlapping, unintelligible, yet filled with a chilling, alien intent. It seemed to press against my skull, burrowing into my thoughts. The air grew heavy, oppressive. A strange, metallic smell filled the room, like blood and ozone. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me. The walls seemed to shift. Not visibly, but in a way I felt deep in my gut, a warping of reality, a subtle distortion of perspective. The angles of the room seemed wrong, the lines no longer straight. Jenna gasped. I followed her gaze to the window. The rain had stopped. The sky outside, no longer the familiar grey of a stormy afternoon, was a swirling vortex of inky blackness, shot through with veins of pulsating violet light. It wasn't a sky I recognized. It wasn't a sky at all. It was a presence. A wave of nausea washed over me. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, the voices now taking on a guttural, rhythmic quality, like some monstrous heartbeat echoing from beyond the veil of reality. I felt a cold, clammy hand grasp my ankle. I screamed, a choked, desperate sound lost in the cacophony of whispers. It wasn't Jenna's hand. Hers were clasped tightly over her mouth, her eyes fixed on the swirling darkness outside. This hand was skeletal, cold, the touch like dry ice against my skin. I looked down. There was nothing there. But I could still feel it, the grip tightening, icy fingers digging into my flesh. Suddenly, the intercom crackled back to life. It wasn't Principal Thompson's voice. It was something else. A voice that resonated with an unearthly depth, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, yet I understood its meaning. It was a promise. A threat. The walls began to pulse, the swirling darkness outside bleeding into the classroom. Jenna and I huddled together, trembling, tears streaming down our faces. The other students, their faces contorted in silent screams, seemed to melt into the shadows. Then, as suddenly as it began, the whispering stopped. The swirling darkness receded. The walls returned to their normal, static state. The air cleared, the metallic smell dissipated. The fluorescent lights flickered back on, casting their sickly yellow glow over the empty classroom. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Sunlight streamed in. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway, a bewildered expression on her face. "Is everyone all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The lockdown, it's over." Jenna and I looked at each other, our eyes wide with terror. The other students were gone. Vanished. The room was empty, except for us and Mrs. Henderson. Where did everyone go?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Henderson frowned. "What are you talking about, Sarah? It was just the three of us in here. It was just a drill." "A drill?" But the whispering, the swirling darkness, the hand. I looked down at my ankle. There, etched into my skin, was a small, circular mark, cold to the touch. It looked like a brand. A symbol I didn't recognize, yet felt a deep, primal fear resonate from its very essence. Jenna saw it too. She gasped, her hand flying to her own ankle. There, mirroring mine, was the same mark. We never spoke of it again. We couldn't. The memory, too horrific to articulate, remained locked within us, a festering wound in our minds. But sometimes, at night, I hear the whispering again. Faint, distant, but undeniably there. And I wonder, where did everyone go? And what truly happened during that lockdown? The walls whisper. And they remember. Story 3. Story 3, The Auditorium. The fluorescent lights buzzed, a dull, monotonous hum that mirrored the drone of Mrs. Henderson's voice as she lectured on Shakespeare. I doodled in the margins of my notebook a grotesque caricature of Macbeth, his crown melting into his skull. 10th grade English. Riveting. Suddenly, the harsh blare of the intercom sliced through the air. Code red. Lockdown. Code red. Lockdown. Mrs. Henderson's face bleached white. The casual chatter of the classroom dissolved into a tense, breathless silence. It wasn't a drill. The urgency in the principal's voice, the tremor in it, told us that. We followed the practiced routine, huddled in the corner, away from the windows, the door locked and lights extinguished. My heart hammered against my ribs. The fear was a palpable thing, a cold, slick hand squeezing my lungs. Whispers snaked through the darkness. What's going on? Is it a shooter? I want to call my mom. Time stretched, warped. The initial panic gave way to a sickening dread. Then, the screaming started. Not the panicked shriek of terror, but something distorted. Gurgling, choked. It came from the auditorium, just down the hall. The whispers stopped. We held our breath, listening. The sound came again, followed by a wet, slapping sound, like meat hitting concrete. My stomach churned. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Minutes later, another sound. A rhythmic thumping, slow and deliberate, growing closer. Thump. Drag. Thump. Drag. The floor vibrated beneath us. Someone whimpered. I clamped a hand over my mouth, tasting the metallic tang of fear. The thumping stopped outside our door. Silence. A suffocating, agonizing silence. Then, the handle jiggled. A slow, testing rattle. We scrambled back, pressing ourselves against the wall, a single, terrified organism. Someone sobbed. The rattling stopped. More silence. Then, a different sound. A low, guttural growl emanating from the hallway just beyond the door. It vibrated through the wood, through the floor, through our bones. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something else. Suddenly, the lights flickered on. We blinked, blinded. The fluorescent hum returned, a jarring counterpoint to the lingering growl. The door remained closed. We waited. Minutes bled into an eternity. The growl was gone. The thumping was gone. The only sound was our ragged breathing. Finally, Mrs. Henderson, her face ashen, crept to the door, peering through the peephole. She gasped, stumbling back, her hand clamped over her mouth. "What is it?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She shook her head, unable to speak. Tears streamed down her face. Slowly, cautiously, she opened the door a crack. I craned my neck, trying to see. The hallway was empty. Except a trail of something stretched down the hall towards the auditorium. It looked like flesh. Torn, pulsing, glistening in the harsh fluorescent light. And the smell. Oh, God, the smell. Sickly sweet, metallic, the cloying stench of decay. It filled the air, burning my nostrils, clinging to the back of my throat. We stayed huddled in the corner, too terrified to move, too terrified to speak. The silence was broken only by the occasional sob. Hours later, the police arrived. They evacuated us, one by one, leading us past the remains in the hallway. I didn't look. I couldn't. They never told us what happened in the auditorium. They never told us what created the trail of flesh. They never told us what made that growl. But I saw it. I smelled it. I felt it. The terror burrowed deep inside me, a parasite feeding on my sanity. I graduated high school. I went to college. I tried to move on. But the memory lingers, a festering wound. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I hear it. The thumping. Drag. Thump. Drag. And then, the growl. And I know, with a chilling certainty, that whatever happened that day in the auditorium, it's not over. Recently, I returned to my hometown. I couldn't resist the pull, the morbid curiosity. The high school was abandoned, slated for demolition. The chain-link fence surrounding it was rusted and broken. I slipped through the gap, drawn back to the source of my nightmares. The building was decaying, windows broken, paint peeling. The silence was heavy, oppressive. I found my way to the auditorium. The doors were locked, but the wood was rotten, easily splintered. Inside, the air was thick with the same sickeningly sweet smell, fainter now, but still recognizable. The stage was empty, the seats covered in dust. But on the floor, near the front row, was a single, dried, brown stain. And next to it, etched into the wood, were 3 deep scratches. Scratches that looked disturbingly like claws. I backed away, a primal fear gripping me. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was far away from the school, far away from the town. But even now, as I write this, I can feel the phantom vibrations of that thumping. Drag. Thump. Drag. And in the silence, I swear I hear a faint, guttural growl. Getting closer. Story 4. Story 4, The Whispering Walls. The fluorescent lights of Mrs. Henderson's English class buzzed overhead, their sickly glow reflecting off the laminated posters of Shakespeare and Chaucer. My eyelids felt heavy, a Friday afternoon slump settling in. Sarah, my best friend, nudged me with her elbow. "Seriously, Maya, if you fall asleep during another soliloquy," she whispered, a playful glint in her eyes. I stifled a yawn. Suddenly, the shrill shriek of the fire alarm ripped through the air, slicing through the monotony. We exchanged confused glances. Fire drills were always announced. This wasn't. Mrs. Henderson's face paled. "Everyone, calmly exit the building," she instructed, her voice strained. The hallways were a chaotic surge of students, the usual Friday afternoon chatter replaced by an uneasy murmur. Outside, the air was crisp and smelled of burning leaves, but there was no sign of smoke or flames. We huddled with our friends near the football field, the unease growing. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Teachers started whispering amongst themselves, their faces etched with worry. That's when the first strange thing happened. A low, guttural growl echoed from within the school building. It was deep, resonating, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. We all fell silent, straining to hear it again. Then, the whispering started. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in a distant wind, but slowly growing louder. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a chorus of unintelligible murmurs that prickled my skin. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her hand gripping my arm. I nodded, unable to speak. The air felt heavy, charged with a strange, oppressive energy. The sun, which had been bright moments before, was now obscured by a thick layer of dark clouds. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. A teacher, Mr. Davies, the burly football coach, stepped forward. "Everyone stay calm," he announced, his voice shaky. "I'm going to check inside." He disappeared through the main entrance. We waited, the whispering growing louder, the murmurs twisting into something that sounded almost human. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, a blood-curdling scream echoed from within the building, followed by a sickening thud. Panic erupted. Students began to cry, pushing and shoving, desperate to escape. But escape what? We didn't know. The whispering intensified, morphing into distinct voices, close, almost inside our heads. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was filled with malice, with hunger. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble. Sarah pulled me towards the woods bordering the football field. "We have to get out of here," she sobbed, her face white with terror. We ran, branches whipping at our faces, the whispers chasing us. We stumbled through the undergrowth, the school building shrinking behind us, but the voices followed, relentless, inescapable. We found a small clearing and collapsed, gasping for breath. The whispering was faint to hear, but still present, a constant, insidious reminder of the horror we'd fled. We huddled together, shivering in the cold, the fear gnawing at us. As darkness fell, the whispers changed again. They weren't murmuring anymore. They were singing. A low, mournful chant that seemed to seep into my bones. And then, through the trees, we saw them. Shapes. Dark, hulking figures moving between the trees, their outlines blurred by the shadows. They didn't walk, they glided, silently, purposefully, as if drawn by the whispering, by the singing. Their forms were vaguely humanoid, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. We watched in horrified silence as they approached the edge of the clearing, their forms becoming clearer in the dim light filtering through the trees. Their faces. I can't describe them. They were more absence than presence, flat, featureless surfaces that swallowed the light. And yet, I could feel their gaze, cold, piercing, stripping away my last vestiges of hope. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, their heads tilted, as if listening. The singing grew louder, and the ground beneath us began to tremble again. Then, one of the figures raised a long, thin arm and pointed directly at us. We screamed. We scrambled to our feet and ran again, blindly, desperately, into the deepening darkness. The singing followed us, the figures followed us, their presence a suffocating weight on our backs. We ran until we could run no more, collapsing in a heap beneath a towering oak tree. The singing stopped. The figures were gone. We lay there for a long time, too terrified to move, too terrified to speak. The silence was almost worse than the whispering. It was a heavy, pregnant silence, filled with the anticipation of something else. Eventually, the first rays of dawn crept through the trees. We slowly made our way back towards the town, avoiding the school, avoiding the woods. We told our story, but no one believed us. The school was empty. There was no sign of the whispering, the singing, the figures. The police dismissed it as mass hysteria, a prank gone wrong. But I know what we saw. I know what we heard. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the trees, I hear it again. The whispering. The singing. And I know that they're still out there, waiting. Waiting for the next lockdown. Waiting for us.